gift bags for those who succeed at the local history quiz, and a bunch of other things where you'll learn a lot more and have some hands-on. Okay, in mid-September, you may notice that we have a big question mark. That's because we are in discussion now with a best-selling author who's written a book on spy women, one of whom lived in South Arlington. So we're trying to figure out that whole thing, and we hope to be able to bring that to you in mid-September. I'll let you read the rest, but I wanted to highlight some of the things that are going on in the next few weeks. Now, what I really want to do is I really want to introduce you to our speaker tonight. So Jessica Kaplan is a retired archivist, and she has been a freelance historical researcher for more than 20 years. Hold on one second. Got it. Okay, so freelance historical researcher for more than 20 years. She has researched and written about other little known Arlington historical topics for the Arlington Historical Magazine, including The Bottom, an African American Enclave Rediscovered, and I Was a Union Man, James and Lewis Marcy's Civil War Experience. A member of the AHS Board of Directors, she is now also the editor of the Arlington Historical Magazine. Don't be surprised that her magazine is for sale over there, including the issue that her article is published in. So if you want more, and there's much more, please feel free. Now, members, you already have a copy of this. So if you are not a member and you would like to be a member, let's talk. Okay. I think one of the major things that Jessica has done so well and that Arlington Historical Society continues to strive to do is to tell the stories of those before us who can't speak now. So Jessica, please.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see you. And I would like to invite the Arlington Historical Society for inviting me to speak about Jewish Arlington. Alexandria City had a German Jewish population going back to about the 1850s. But none of them settled in Alexandria County. And that is the rural area of what was Alexandria in the 19th century up to 1920. And it's now what we call Arlington. And I'm going to use Arlington for our talk today, even though really part of the time the community was Alexandria County. The first Jews I could reliably document came to Arlington around 1900. Their numbers, as you can see in this chart, continued to grow. And I stopped by 1930 because there were so many people in the census that I couldn't start pulling out immigrants and what language they spoke and Jewish last names to try and tease out who was possibly Jewish and who wasn't. And I made the decision that I was going to stick to a more narrative article rather than trying to get more statistical. Well, who were the Jews that settled in Arlington? What you see up here is a family. They are the Iskow family, and they were from Mohilev, Belarus. And this shot was taken there in the 1890s. Like the Iskows, most of the Jews who settled in Arlington were from Eastern Europe and from Russia, not from Germany. A lot of them had faced a great deal of anti-Semitism in the old country. They were forbidden to own land. They were forced into specific occupations. Their sons were forced into the military, often at the age of 12 or 13. And they also were the victims of pogroms, which were violence against Jews in the area. So it wasn't surprising that a lot of them decided to leave, and they immigrated to the United States to a lot of the major cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago. And from the major cities, they sort of fanned out into the rest of the United States and went into some of the smaller communities like Arlington. These families generally spoke Yiddish, and both men and women in the families had business skills, which they had used in the old country. Around 1900, a few Jewish immigrants started opening shops in Arlington. And one of these was a man named Joseph Bloom, and he was a tailor. He was a Romanian Jew. And when he came to Arlington, he boarded with a household of other tailors. He eventually got a job as the post tailor at Fort Myer. And when he got that position, he then brought his family down. They lived in Philadelphia at the time, and settled them in Arlington. And you can see here some county homes. Mr. Joseph Bloom has just completed a house on Columbia Pike. So he was doing well. He could build his own home. Menachem and Esther Scher, they came to the US from Austria-Hungary. And they were pretty typical of early Jewish families in Arlington. Their son lived in Washington, and he helped them buy a store in Arlington. And I don't know if any of you have seen pictures of this store before, but a family called the Berner family had owned this store till about 1907, 1910. And it was on Columbia Pike. And that building is now, it's sitting where the Arlington Cinema and Draft House is today, which is kind of cool. They had no electricity when they moved there, no running water, and Columbia Pike was unpaved. The store was considered, I consider the store a mom and pop establishment. It was a single room shop, and the family lived above and behind the store, which was common in those establishments. It was independently owned and operated by the family. And the startup costs were really low, and usually family and friends would help with startup costs. The family sold general merchandise, and that included groceries, meats, dry goods, notions, clothing, and animal feed. It was a hard life. The family worked literally 24/7. The kids worked before school, delivering groceries and stocking the shelves. After school, they worked doing probably the same chores. And their only day off was usually Sunday morning. And that's because that's when church was. And most Arlingtonians were in church because they weren't Jewish, they were Christian. The labor of the entire Scher family was needed to pull off this hard work and to make ends meet. They had 5 children, and Esther maintained the house as well as helping run the store. And these are 2 of their kids. Over here, Joe and Jaime. Max and Fanny Hyman moved to Arlington around 1910, and they were another pretty typical Arlington Jewish family. They rented a store, and it was in the Queen City area of East Arlington. And as some of you may know, that was a predominantly African-American community. And this this was a way that Jews often got started in business by going into Black neighborhoods. The startup costs were extremely low and other whites shunned these areas. They built good relations in the neighborhoods, and I think one of the reasons was that the Jewish shopkeepers would extend credit to the families, and it was something that was really needed in the African-American communities. They did have good relations, but I will say that it was just a business relationship. I think the Jewish families, being in the South especially, were worried about white retribution if they decided to somehow cross that color line. This building on the right, does anyone know what building that is? Green Valley Pharmacy. It's a really well-known historical building in Arlington. In 1941, Queen City was demolished to make way for the Pentagon. And Joe and William Hyman, sons of Max Hyman, built the Green Valley Pharmacy building and opened a grocery there. And it was another African-American neighborhood that they were working in. So I think it was a very comfortable fit for them. They eventually sold the building to Doc Muse, who then opened up the Green Valley Pharmacy. Morris and Esther Kiseleff, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of Esther. They sold their grocery in Washington, D.C., and they moved to Arlington around 1916. They came here because their son Harold had polio, and his doctors felt that if they lived in a more rural area, it would be better for his health. So the family bought a store in Aurora Heights, and it's interesting that today it's Langston Boulevard, where the store is, right near Highland Street. And it's, I don't know if you guys know it, it's the 7-Eleven with the burger joint. That's where his store was. The family had a fair amount of tragedy, I'm afraid. In 1908, Esther died, and Morris pulled his eldest daughter, Josephine, out of school. She was at WNL, and she had to care for her younger siblings and the store with him. And I think it was pretty typical for the time that he would pull a daughter and not a son. A lot of the Jewish families felt that a son's education was more important than a daughter's. I do love this picture of him. Morris Kiseleff in 1921 joined a grocery store cooperative. It was called DGS, or District Grocery Stores. It was made up of a group of Jewish grocers in the DC area who'd been discriminated against by wholesalers. By coming together, they leveraged their buying power and were able to negotiate a lot lower prices. DGS was really successful. By the 1930s, it had grown in leaps and bounds, and it had both Jewish and non-Jewish grocers who belonged to it. And it was pretty important as some of these chain groceries started moving into the area, like Giant and A&P, because this cooperative enabled them to compete price-wise. Lottie and Aaron Iskow were from Mohilev, Belarus, and they opened a grocery in Rosslyn. I emailed with their grandson, which was fun. He was on Ancestry and I found him. And he told me that the family chose to come to Arlington because of its affordability. But he did say, more importantly, the family was extremely religious. They were quite Orthodox. And they picked Rosslyn because it was in walking distance to Kesher, Israel, which is an Orthodox synagogue in Georgetown. So very important where they actually located themselves. The synagogue, or in Yiddish, the shul, is the heart of a Jewish community. And Arlington had no shul. So the families went to the District of Columbia or to Alexandria to attend holiday services. Right here on the left is Kesher Israel Congregation, which is the one the Iskow family went to. And on the right here is Tiferet Israel, and that the Sher family worshiped at Tiferet Israel. And Menachem, the patriarch of the family, is actually buried there. Tiferet is also an Orthodox synagogue and had a very much Eastern European population. So practicing Judaism was kind of difficult in Arlington, which was really majority Christian area. So as I alluded to before, the only free time families had was on Sunday morning when other Arlingtonians were in church and weren't shopping. But the Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday. And that was probably the busiest time for the different families, Jewish families. No, for the Christian families who would do shopping. And unfortunately, the families to make it would have to keep the stores open. Another problem they had was keeping kosher. And I think everybody probably knows what kosher is, but it was impossible to buy kosher meat in Arlington. You'd have to go to the District of Columbia, and that was difficult, and people didn't have freezers to keep the meat. So I think being able to maintain Jewish rules around keeping kosher fell to the wayside. Also, I don't think that some of these early families were really too sad about that. As Bill Ahrens, in this quote that's up there, wrote in his Southern history called Shalom Y'all, the counter life was really more important than the afterlife. In the late 1920s, a man named George Wasserman, a Russian Jew, opened a service station on Wilson Boulevard near the Morey School. It didn't take him very long to realize that he could make a lot more money selling radios. So he quickly purchased this building and opened George's Radio Shop. And can anyone tell me what's in that building right now? It's in Clarendon. Liberty Tavern. Yeah, that's right. So that building's been reused over and over and over. It's very fun. George's brother was Al Wasserman, and he married a woman named Bertha Rubin, and they bought the service station from George. Bertha pumped the gas and Al fixed the cars. Soon enough, they were selling Hupmobiles, they were selling Chryslers, and they were selling Plymouths. And by the late 1930s, they had overgrown the space they were in and decided to build Al's Motors that you see right here. And that's on Wilson Boulevard near Quincy. And it's a Gold's Gym right now. I don't know if y'all recognize that building. Bertha was always in the business with Al, and he passed away before her, and she continued in the business. This is a super fun photo. Al is in the middle, and it turns out he was a strong man. And what he is doing is he's got all four men he's holding up. And I got this from a newspaper article that the Wasserman family gave me. And the article says he walked around the room several times holding these four men. So I'm thinking Al was quite a character. Albert and Catherine Cohen opened a grocery in the Buckingham area of Arlington in 1923. It became a springboard to a real estate business, a brokerage business, and a credit bureau business. And Catherine was Al's partner throughout. In the late 1930s, Al got into development, and this middle picture is of a hotel that he had tried to build on Route 50, but could not get the zoning for. So that does not look familiar, I'm sure. Catherine Cohen, his wife, was a real entrepreneur in her own right. And I think that was really rare for women at the time. We're in the 1920s now. Like I said, she partnered with Al in all his businesses, and she pretty much ran their credit bureau. In 1928, she started the Arlington County Business Women's Club. And this is her right there. She was the first president of the club, and the club was very active in lobbying for girls' education and in helping young women find meaningful careers. So good stuff. Catherine also started the Credit Women's Breakfast Club. Wow, who knew? That was a thing, but she did this in 1929, and it continued for many years. Catherine was on the board of many nonprofits, and they were both Jewish nonprofits and non-Jewish. But I have to say, like this Arlington Women's professional group, she was usually the token Jew, and that was pretty characteristic of the times. So not all Jewish businesses were successful. Quite a few were not. Many operated for a year or two before closing, and some, like Louis Rubin's fancy grocery store, received very checkered reviews. And I got this quote from an oral history at the library, and it says, "Rubin's store was quite a sad little grocery store. My mother would go in, and if the cat was on the meat block, come home." Ah. Oh, all sorts of health code violations come to mind, yes. Jews in the early part of the 20th century faced a fair amount of discrimination in American life. They were not able to join a lot of social clubs, country clubs. They couldn't go to leisure resorts. Some hotels wouldn't accept them. And a lot of neighborhoods had housing covenants that kept them from living there. But there was one Arlington family that, when faced with discrimination, decided to face it head on. And that was the Bloom family. And I did tell you about Joseph Bloom, the tailor, before, who worked at Fort Myer. His son, Frank, had gone to high school in Washington. And when he graduated, he went into the Army. In 1911, he took the preliminary exam to become an officer, and he failed. The commander of Fort Myer, Joseph Gerard, explained why he failed. "Though upright, honest, and probably deserving, the applicant is the son of Mr. Joseph Bloom of Jewish persuasion, who is now and has been a tailor at this post. I would not desire him in my command as an officer, as a social and personal associate. I have found few communities where Jews are received as desirable social associates." So when Frank's mother read this, she was enraged. And I get the feeling she was a woman that you didn't want to tangle with. She took the issue to B'nai B'rith, which was sort of a human rights organization, to one of the officers. His name was Simon Wolf, and he was pretty well known in Washington. Well, Simon Wolf somehow took the issue to President Taft. I don't know, they knew each other or he just knew enough people to get Taft's ear. And when Taft heard about this, he strongly denounced it as un-American and contrary to the ideals and principles of the US Army and our nation. And soon after, Frank Bloom was able to take the officer's exam. This story just, I find very powerful because Frank served in World War I and then became a civil servant for the government. And he again served in World War II, despite all this. And his brother Rudolph became a doctor and he fought in World War I and World War II as well. This family served this country well. Well, the bitterness of the Bloom incident caused the family to move back to Philadelphia, where they had originated in America. And they sold their house. And this is the house, it's on 2nd and Wayne, near Fort Myer. But of course, it wouldn't have had all these additions on it. And the Finkelsteins opened a grocery. But in 1913, their world was rocked when Fagel Finkelstein, who was David's first wife, whom he had abandoned, walked into the store and said to David, "Do you remember me?" And he said to her, "No, I have no idea who you are," despite their 3 kids together. I'm going to back up a little and tell you more of their story. David and Fagel were from Russia, and they had moved to New York City in the early 1900s and had 2 children. And when David said to Fagel, "You know, I don't think we're ever going to be able to start a business if I can't raise more money. So how about you go back to Russia and I can save everything that I earn, and then I'll bring you back over and I'll buy a store." And she was game. And she was also pregnant when she went back to Russia with their 3rd child. For a year, he sent child support, and then suddenly she didn't hear from him again. And she said there were several articles in the paper, that she thought he had passed away until she received a thick packet of documents in English from Virginia. And she couldn't read it and she had to find someone who could. And it turned out it was divorce papers from David. And in the papers, he had said that she had abandoned him by going back to Russia. She immediately sold her house in Russia and came to the United States, and she had to be resourceful because she tracked him down and came to his store. She also got the support of Hebrew Charities, and they did pro bono work for her case, and she sued David for child support. And he was, I don't actually know the true story, but he refused to pay child support at first, and then the court enforced it, and he did. So I don't know what became of Vega. I actually tried to find her in the census and newspapers, but she seems to have disappeared. But I do know that Anna remained with David, his second wife, and I don't know why. It was not boring and early Arlington, clearly. Between the world wars, Arlington's second generation of Jewish residents came of age. And these men and women had a real leg up from their parents. They spoke unaccented English. They had grown up with financial stability. They knew the American cultural norms, and they had been educated in Arlington's fantastic schools, They had gone to elementary school and to middle school here. And after 1925, when W&L opened, they went to W&L. These men and women had a great desire to Americanize, but they did hit a brick wall when they tried to enter higher education and the workforce. There were a lot of quotas in American schools at that time for Jews, especially if you wanted to be a doctor. And in the work world, if you wanted to go into law or banking or insurance and you were Jewish, it was extremely difficult. Banks also didn't want to provide Jews startup money for businesses. So ever resourceful to overcome these hurdles, the Jewish community started the Hebrew Free Loan Association that provided either low cost or low interest loans. And a lot of these men and women started their own businesses. And right here, you see Dependable Cleaners. That was started by Charlie Scher, and his parents had the general merchandise store on Columbia Pike. And then Herman Iskal opened up a grocery. So the Depression was a pretty difficult time for Arlingtonians. The Jewish community tightened their belts, and I heard from different families that kids tried to get jobs and fathers took second jobs. And at the Scher store, I know they started bartering instead of using cash. But there was a silver lining, and that was the New Deal. FDR, when he started the New Deal, wanted to hire the best and brightest to staff the agencies he created. And for the very first time, he allowed the government to hire Jews at high-level, meaningful positions. This really was a boon for the Jewish community, and there was an influx of Jewish New Dealers who came to the Washington metropolitan area. So a large number of stores opened to service the influx of new dealers in Arlington. I was wondering, this is a quiz, if anyone can tell me what this Amoco station became that is still in existence today. Huh? No. Think cars. It's American Service Station, which is on Glebe Road. And it was started by Saul Brooks and his brother-in-law, Saul Gordon. And it started as an Amoco station and grew and grew. Down here is beloved Public Shoe Store, which was started by the Friedman family. It was in Clarendon. And I bet most of you remember that store. Another quiz, Community Drug Company opened in the Buckingham area. And it was started by Milton Ellsberg and Robert Gerber. And it actually morphed into a very big chain store. Can anyone tell me what that was?
Drug Fair and now CVS.
You got it. Excellent. Oh, it was Drug Fair. It became Drug Fair. And now CVS, which I didn't realize. No, it was Drug Fair. Over here is National Pawnbrokers, and it was started by a man named Louis Shellick, and I'm very dear friends with his granddaughter, and she used to take me there as a kid. It was so when I saw that this opened in 1938 and started in Rosslyn, and of course it's by Spout Run now. It was kind of exciting. Down here, I have an ad for the Tayshoff hardware store. They were in Crystal City, and then Arlington Hardware, which was on Columbia Pike and was owned by the Eisen family. And up here is the shop of Saul Cohen, which was on Columbia Pike. And there's one other store I could not find a photo of, but is still in business, and that's Dominion Electric, and started in 1938, not far from where it's sitting today. Well, the new dealers changed life for Arlington Jews. They had come from cities all over the United States that had large Jewish populations, and they had a Jewish infrastructure. They had synagogues, they had Jewish community centers, theater, restaurants, and they got to Arlington and there was nothing. And they felt very isolated and disconnected to Jewish life without a synagogue. And in the late 1930s, a group got together and created a synagogue called Ohev Shalom Congregation. They didn't have a home. They met in the Jones Building in Clarendon. They met at Ashton Women's Center. But they finally decided that they couldn't not have a home. And they reached out to two men that I talked about earlier, old timers now, Al Wasserman and Albert Cohen, to help them find land in Arlington and to help with financing so that they could build a synagogue. And I believe the two men gladly helped. And the result was this synagogue. They broke ground in 1947 to start building it. At this time, it became the Arlington Jewish Center. I think it was the two Als with their local business knowledge and their contacts that really helped them make it happen. So for the first time, the Arlington Jewish community had a home. It had a synagogue. And I bookended my talk to 1940 because that's really when the congregation began. And I feel like for the first time, there was a real Jewish community. It had finally gelled. And now, 75 years later, I don't know how many of you read this in the paper, but Northern Virginia boasts the largest Jewish population in the metropolitan area. So there you have it, the early Jews of Arlington. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah. Where it is, oh, where was the Arlington Jewish Center? It's Route 50 in Fillmore. And that, yeah, that's where the synagogue is today. It's called Etz Hayim. And a shout out to Etz Hayim. They helped me with some of my research and I got this photograph from them. They were lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, you said that the initial pattern was Eastern Europe and Russia. When did that change or did it change substantially?
Oh, when did the immigration pattern change? It started changing in the 1920s. After World War I, there was a pretty big anti-immigrant movement. I had a slide and I took it out, but the KKK was very active and they were against basically Jews from Eastern Europe and immigrants from Southern Europe and Asian immigrants. And in 1924, there was the Johnson-Reed Act, and that actually halted, not completely, but basically halted immigration to the US.
Jessica,
yeah.
Jessica, when somebody asks from the audience, can you repeat their question so we can hear it online?
Yeah, I'll try and remember.
Thank you.
Yes.
Were there any Sephardic immigrants from North Africa or Turkey or Spain?
Not in this early period. Oh, I'm so sorry. A man asked if there were any Sephardic Jews that came in from North Africa or the Balkans or Turkey. And the answer is early on, no. But one of the early founders of Ohev Shalom was a man named Abraham Beta. And that just sounds North African to me. I don't know if it is. They're Syrian. So a little bit later.
So I have a
Yeah.
question from the Zoom.
Okay.
Somebody says, did you do any research into Sephardic, Mizrahim, and or Black Jews in Arlington? There was or is no mention of any of these groups.
Correct, because during that period, I couldn't find any. This was pretty early on for the Jewish community here. Remember, we had like 20 families in 1920, so it's not even a lot of people we're talking about.
So the follow-up question then from this group is, what is the Jewish population in Arlington today approximately?
I don't know, to put it bluntly, yes. Can I take an audience question now?
Mhm.
Okay,
And then
yeah,
come back to me.
okay.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation about Bethel Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria. I was wondering if you could say anything more about the relationship, and since it was the only synagogue in Northern Virginia, to what extent it tried to help Jews in Arlington, or anything more you could add on that would be appreciated.
Yeah, Bethel, a gentleman wanted to know about Bethel Hebrew Congregation in Alexandria and if they tried to help in any way in Arlington and what the relationship was. Bethel was started by German Jews and had a long history that predated the Civil War. And when the Russian Jews started coming into this area, there was kind of a clash between the Germans and the Russian Jews. And I think that the German Jews they had been established. They had been in America for decades and had businesses, and they were a little bit ashamed of their Russian brethren who were right off the boat, basically. So there was some helping, Hayas existed at that time. I don't think Bethel did much, to be honest. There was an influx of Russian Jews who actually did go to Alexandria City, but I didn't look into them. There was another synagogue in the teens called Agudas Hakim that was built, and that's more the Russian Jews. I couldn't find a photograph, and I really couldn't find any specific family that mentioned having gone to Agudas Hakim, but I didn't want to rule out the fact that Alexandria was so close, and even in the same county at first, that the families wouldn't have traveled there to attend temple. Thank you. Yeah, Sean. Oh, okay, Zoom. Is there a Zoom question?
Yes, there is a couple of Zoom questions. Let me give you a couple. First of all, do you have any knowledge of the Bergman's Cleaners that was in Arlington, if those founders were Jewish?
They were Jewish, but they lived in the District of Columbia. And this was just a branch store, not their original store.
Okay.
So yeah, so I didn't mention that, but yeah, they were an old business here for sure.
All right, here's another one. Did the Jewish community organize to counter the Ku Klux Klan's anti-Semitism? If so, were there any fire bombings or lynchings in retaliation by the KKK that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. You know, the KKK was pretty strong in Arlington in the 20s. I read something that called Arlington a Klan town and said that they had a listing in the phone book. But I think the Klan pretty much was very anti-immigrant and was working off intimidation by marching through areas like Cherrydale and having cross burnings in Ballston. I think the cross burnings, though, were more aimed towards the African-American community there. But I think there was just a fair amount of intimidation and discomfort with it. But I don't know of any organizations in Arlington that sprang up to counter that. I think people were afraid, and it wasn't too far from, the rise of Hitler too. And I think Jews decided to be quiet and try and not be noticed, not to make waves. And I think a lot of other Jews decided to completely Americanize and pretend they weren't Jewish. It was hard back then.
So I have a comment from somebody, kind of a follow-up of an earlier question. They say, most Jewish history wipes out or ignores non-Ashkenazi Jews on the premise that they cannot find them. Usually they're there, but the dominant community is clueless on how to look for them. It's a major problem throughout US Jewish history that has ignored the existence of these groups for centuries.
Well, I happen to be married to one of them. So I am not ignoring them. But basically, you know, I found most of these people through the newspapers and the census, and it tells you what countries they immigrated from. And I did not see anyone who, you know, I could pick out as being Jewish who was, you know, from North Africa or Turkey. I didn't really see much immigration to this area from there. So no, I don't think I messed up, but hey, ain't absolutely possible.
Well, and they may, you know, this may be something that needs to be even more reported beyond. So we don't know, like you said, you only had a few families that you were researching because
Yeah.
the population was so small.
So Art, you had a question?
Thank you. I was just gonna ask Jessica, in your research for the, I don't know, the descendants, and you mentioned using the ancestors, where was the diaspora? Were most of the people you reached out to still in the area, in the DMV?
Sean asked if the descendants of some of these families I researched were still in the DMV. There are some. Al Wasserman's family is in Potomac, and some of the families in right around the Richmond area. The Scher family, they lived here for years and years and years. Two of their children did oral histories that are in the library that were so informative. And I believe that they have children who are still here. Although I did call one who had passed away recently, who was the family historian. So yeah, and then the two families, the Iskov family and the Kiselev family, I think the Kiselevs are in this area, but it was all through email and I didn't ask where they were. Yeah.
So I was going to share two pieces of information.
Wait, one sec. We're going to get two pieces of information shared by someone in the audience.
And then I have a question.
Many people may know, but so the rabbi at Arlington Fairfax for many years was Marvin Bash. And his son, Jeremy Bash, who was then married to Dana Bash.
It was on TV.
They're not married. I didn't know that. I mean, Rabbi Bash was quite a force in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but I did put it together that that was his focus. The other thing is the people who now run Mercy Service Center, Mark said, is family to the people who started the Mercy Service Center. And Mark's father, Morty, still lives. Which he did a couple of years ago. He lives in Potomac. He's a wonderful storyteller. And he tells a story about how it became a Mercedes dealership. Because it was a Studebaker dealership. And he was married to his wife was the daughter of the Gordon Never. And at some point Mercedes came to talk to them about the Mercedes deal, and the father knew nothing about Mercedes, but Morty had served in Germany and ridden in Mercedes. He said, "Oh, you must do that." But and there's also they were related to A. Poland. So it'd be worth getting in touch with Morty. He's here in the winter. I mean, he's here in the summer in Florida. He's a wonderful, wonderful storyteller, and tells a story about how he started being a salesman. rolling forward, rolling around in the chair. Well worth it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, how are you gonna summarize that?
I've
Oh,
got
I need to summarize that? Okay, so a man in the crowd says that there was a rabbi at, yes, Arlington Jewish Center. His name was Marvin Bash, and his son, what's his son's name? Jeremy Bash, who's a journalist, and his wife, they're now divorced, was Dana Bash, who was on CNN, I think. Yeah. So just an interesting tidbit there. And that the owners of American Service Center are still in the area. Mark Zetlin works there.
And he's a member of AHS.
Okay, he owns it. And I actually did write a little piece about Mark Zetlin in our newsletter once. But his father, Morty, according to the man in our crowd, Art, is a great storyteller and drove a Mercedes during World War II when he was in Germany, and just was blown away by that Mercedes. So they went from Studebakers to selling Mercedes. Okay, thanks.
So here's one from, we're getting several questions. I'm going to try to see if I can get to. Here's one. Was the redlining of Blacks and Jews contemporaneous, or was there any difference in the timeframes for the two groups being prevented from home ownership?
They were, I don't think it was redlining with the Jews. It was just housing covenants. I don't, although I really didn't look into bank loans. But it was certainly at around the same time. I would say it was a lot worse for African Americans, and went on much longer.
Okay, yeah, trying to. Did President Taft abolish the Army's discrimination of Jews attaining officer rank by congressional law or by executive action?
Wait, say it again, please. Sorry.
When President Taft you had the case about the gentleman that wanted the officer's exam, and the question was, do you know if President Taft abolished the Army's discrimination of Jews attaining officer rank by a congressional law, by just a rebuke, or by executive action?
Yeah, it was just a rebuke.
Okay.
I don't think anything was codified.
And then we have another comment about the that some of the Jews came in earlier. I know you've focused on Arlington Jews, but let's see. I'm trying to find it. Sorry. That some of them actually came here and they're descendants from the Spanish Inquisition, and that they might not show up on immigration records. You know, I know that you were.
Yeah, I think those are called conversos, and they,
yeah,
a lot of them didn't know they were Jewish, but they performed rituals that were Jewish, and over time, families figured out that these were remains from the Spanish Inquisition. But I think most of those families went to Mexico and the Southwest, where Spanish was spoken. It's a little bit easier, but I think their kids are all over the United States now. Very, very interesting story. Yeah.
I think that's it from the Zoom right now.
Okay, we have someone from the audience. Yeah.
So much of our history is contained in cemeteries. I was curious when King David Memorial Gardens was started. And if you found anything about art, I know it doesn't always say what town they're from, but I know that many of our Jewish friends are there.
Yeah, so the question was about King David Cemetery, which is, I think it's in Falls Church, Fairfax. It's on Lee Highway, and a lot of Jews from Arlington are buried there. Absolutely. And everywhere else. Exactly. But I don't know when it opened. I'm sorry. It's a good question. Yeah. Yes, you had a question, right?
Well, I have a question and some comments. My question was about Tenerife Synagogue that you pictured. I wondered where that was.
Tiferet Israel?
Yes,
It's on 14th and Euclid Streets,
so it's upper northwest.
upper northwest, yes.
Okay.
It was a schlep,
Yeah, it was,
but it was worth it, yeah.
still
Um,
still in existence. My comments are that Buddhist Hakim is conservative. In Judaism, like in most religions, there are a lot of branches, and Agudas Hakim is conservative, whereas Bethel was Reform congregation, and Agudas Hakim is in Alexandria, but very close to Shirley, on Valley Lane in Alexandria. But anyway, getting back to Bethel, the picture you showed, and there is a historical marker on King Street where Bethel originally stood. It now exists on Seminary Road in Alexandria. But also, the history of Bethel is that, and you mentioned this, there might have been a dispute between some people attending Bethel. They established in the 60s a congregation called Temple Road of Shalom, which is a Reformed congregation. And I belong there. It's although I was bar mitzvah at Arlington Fairfax Jewish Center on
Wonderful.
Route 50, right? And I remember the rabbi before Rabbi Bash. So, and I also, another comment is Flori Jagoda, very famous singer of Sephardic heritage, was a member of Arlington Fairfax, or now it's Haim, and she wrote a beautiful song, Hanukkah song for children, with counting the candles in Spanish. And she was just, she died a number of years ago. We're sorry to lose her.
So I just learned a ton from a gentleman in the audience who talked about Bethel congregation in Alexandria and how close it is to Arlington. And there's a marker now, you said, on Seminary Road.
No, the
No.
marker is on King Street.
The marker's on King Street,
And
okay.
the congregation is presently on Seminary.
The congregation's on Seminary Road. But he also, I think the online audience will be interested, a woman named Flori Jagoda. And I think she's a Balkan Jew, is that correct? Yeah. She's from Sarajevo. Belonged to the Arlington Jewish congregation. I knew that, but she's also from the later period, so I really didn't do much work on her, on her at all. But she was a Sephardic musician, extremely talented. And I think, did she live in Arlington as well, or?
Might have been close to Fairfax.
Close to Fairfax. Okay, she lived in Lake Barcroft. So definitely Sephardic peoples ended up settling here after that 1940 period. Of course, again, there's my husband. He settled here. Yeah, another question.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to add a comment. I grew up in Alexandria and went to Bethel, and Rabbi Frank in the 1960s apparently was very involved in the civil rights movement, and Rodef was a breakaway because some people were unhappy with that.
Oh, okay. A gentleman just talked about something I forgot. The other man talked about it as well, that Rodef Shalom was a breakaway congregation from Bethel. And it happened around the time of the civil rights movement. There was some disagreement.
Yeah, he was active in the, I think, late 50s, 60s before the, up
Right.
to 69.
Okay.
The next rabbi.
Okay.
So,
So, and I guess was Rabbi Berkowitz was he at Bethel also, or?
No,
No, okay.
he was, Rabbi Berkowitz was hired by the families who left Bethel, and he is really established TRS Temple Road of.
Temple, okay.
It's the biggest synagogue in maybe Virginia, certainly.
Yeah, so Rodef Shalom, which is in Fairfax County, is the biggest synagogue in Northern Virginia now. It's a beautiful, beautiful building, yeah.
So I'd like to thank Jessica Kaplan for her presentation tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.